Just over 51 years ago, on September 8, 1966, the first episode of Star Trek aired on NBC. The show was kind of a failure. It aired for 3 seasons, and it really would have only aired for 2 if it wasn't for a letter-writing campaign from the fans. It was never particularly popular during the 60s. But in the 70s, in syndication, the show would gain new life and become a cultural phenomenon that lasts to this very day. However, while September 8th, 1966 will be an important date in the minds of Trekkies for generations to come because of that being the first day that Star Trek aired, the first episode was actually produced 2 years prior. In 1964, Gene Roddenberry wrote and produced an episode, The Cage, meant to be the original pilot for the series, in which we meet Captain Christopher Pike and his valiant crew. Unfortunately for Gene Roddenberry, but fortunately for the rest of us, the network refused The Cage. However, they also thought that the concept was interesting and with some tweaks could actually be rather successful. And we're going to explore a little bit about why The Cage failed, but also what the role of the studio is in all this compared to Gene Roddenberry. But for right now, we're going to focus in on Star Trek Episode 0, The Cage. Before we get into the episode proper, which won't take very long because the plot in this episode is, well, rather simplistic, but I want to talk briefly about Gene Roddenberry and his quote-unquote vision. Gene Roddenberry has been celebrated by his fans over the last 5 decades about being the visionary artist who brought to life this incredible world of diversity and gave us a hopeful, bright future for mankind. And while that's partially true, I think that there was an underlying layer of deception upon Roddenberry's part. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Gene Roddenberry was a horrible person. I never met him. However, it seems very clear that, number one, he has no compunction about misleading people about his various projects. As we're going to see in this first quick clip from the introduction to The Cage, Gene Roddenberry himself fully admits that he lied to the studio executives about what it was that he was going to produce for them.
I wanted to sell my series, so I had promised the network that my Star Trek idea would be little more than a space western. A wagon train to the stars, zap guns instead of 6-shooters, spaceships instead of horses. But as I began writing that pilot, I suddenly realized that here was a chance to do the kind of drama I'd always dreamed of doing.
The term wagon train to the stars has been used to describe the original series for generations since its original air date. Rather ironic considering that Star Trek's creator used the phrase as little more than a simple bait and switch so that he could get the studio to fund his pet project, which had nothing to do with being a space western. The studio outright rejected the concept. But they did see potential in the idea, so they did commission an altered second pilot with some studio input, if you will. And that's when we get to the most ironic part of the creation of the original Star Trek. A lot of people to this day think that studio interference is the cause of the downfall of modern cinema and television, that studio executives bent on making a profit destroy projects left and right in the name of the almighty dollar. And while that can occasionally be true, in the case of Star Trek, their changes drastically improve the show. And this is where I get kind of fed up with Roddenberry fanboys and Roddenberry himself. Because, well, let's look at one real quick clip from that same introduction of Roddenberry patting himself on the back about, well, how progressive his project really was.
Back in those days before the phrase women's lib was ever heard, I put a woman second in command of our starship. On top of which my script required our actress, Majel Barrett, to play this woman as having a highly superior computerized mind.
We're going to get on to what he said in a second, but I wanted to pause it right here real quick to point out that he's trying to talk about how awesome he is for putting a woman as the first officer on the ship and how she had a highly computerized superior mind, whatever that means. But the problem here is that, and this is a common problem today in cinema, is that the character of number one, played by Majel Barrett, was, well, it's funny because the show itself calls her out about it.
The female you call number one has the superior mind and would produce highly intelligent children. Although she seems to lack emotion, this is largely a pretense. She often has fantasies involving you.
So the show, written by Gene Roddenberry, points out that while number one appears to be this logical-minded, highly intellectual person, that's all just a pretense because she's really underneath just a weak woman and everything. Hollywood does not understand overall how to write good women in stories. You know, if you look at characters like Ellen Ripley from the Alien franchise, she is a woman who is put into an extraordinary circumstances and elevates herself. Same thing with Sarah Connor from the Terminators franchise. There are many examples of good, strong women throughout Hollywood history, but simply taking a woman and giving her the appearance of a man as far as her attitude, and ironically in this show then calling her out for that very same thing, is not making for a strong woman. But let's move on to what Gene Roddenberry had to say about how awesome he is.
You might have thought the ladies in our test audience would have appreciated that. Instead, their comments were, "Who does she think she is?"
Perhaps, Mr. Roddenberry, it's simply because those women in your test audiences didn't like being shown that the way to elevate themselves is to simply imitate masculinity.
And I had written in another character who wasn't even human. An alien who looked like Satan himself, complete with pointy ears. Was that all? No, I was uncooperative in other ways, too. For example, no one aboard the USS Enterprise smoked, and tobacco advertising was key to network profits in those days. Also, I had refused to cast our crew sensibly, which meant all whites. And when the network finally saw the pilot, some of their executives were outraged.
I'm sorry. Okay. Let me. Sorry. The non-smoking thing, fine. Yeah, that's good. But let's take a look at his not all white cast.
All that nonsense about the dangers of mixed races living together on a spaceship or anywhere, and how some parts of our country were certain to refuse to televise Star Trek because we showed such things. The hatred that would supposedly flood our mail, turning sponsors against us.
38-1. 38 white cast members, 1 Asian cast member. that was the cast of The Cage. And Gene Roddenberry is sitting there patting himself on the back for being so bold as to have this mixed race cast for the original pilot. I'm at a loss. I genuinely don't know why he would say this, because this video, though, of Gene Roddenberry is him not talking about Star Trek as a whole. He is talking specifically about The Cage. The video is from the introduction to The Cage that he recorded specifically for the VHS release of The Cage. So, yeah, this makes no sense whatsoever. But let's get into the story of The Cage itself, which, let's be frank, this isn't going to take long because there's really not much there. The Cage is about the power of imagination and fantasy, which may seem like a nice, deep topic for a science fiction show, and it does provoke some interesting ideas. If you could live out any fantasy life you choose versus live in the real world, which would you choose? I don't know about you, but for me, a nice long retirement on TOS 4 sounds pretty darn good. The problem with The Cage is not the concept, it's the execution of that concept. Frankly, my problem with The Cage is not that it's too cerebral, rather that it's just plain boring. And I know some people think that only the intellectually gifted can follow such a cerebral show as The Cage. But consider for a moment another film, another work in Star Trek, in fact, another original series Star Trek. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan is anything but boring. However, it's probably one of the most intelligent science fiction movies to come out in the last 50 years. Now, granted, there are some great intelligent sci-fi films also accompanying it, but Star Trek II, for this example, has many literary references, parallels, and allegories, and it deals with some deep themes besides just shooting the phasers and making big explosions. It's about growing old. It's about obsession. It's about revenge. It's Shakespeare in space. It's a lot of things that are anything but dumb. Now, Captain Pike and his crew at the beginning of this episode get a distress call from Talos 4, an uncharted planet at the time. And when they arrive, they find a small group of survivors, but the whole thing is just a ploy by big-headed aliens known only as the Talosians. They are the natives, of course, of Talos 4. They have the ability to summon any illusion they wish. They can pull it right out of your mind and make it as real as anything that you experience, which means that you can feel pain, you can be forced to do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do simply by making you think that the button that's to activate, say, the transporter is actually the self-destruct switch. The makeup for these aliens is awesome. It's top-notch, especially when you stop to consider that this is 1964. But for some reason, I keep thinking of a song every time they walk by. I can't quite place it. Baby got back. Anyway, the Talosians want Pike to mate with a human female that they acquired some time ago because they want to breed a race of... Well, there's an interesting question. It kind of depends on when in the episode we're talking. You see, earlier on in the episode, we find out that the Talosians want humans because of our incredible imagination and adaptability, because they use their power of illusion like a narcotic, and it fuels their entire society. And that's why they have this menagerie, hence the term for the episode as it got broken into two parts later on in the original series, of various different alien races that they can experiment on and create illusions for. Now that is an interesting concept, but the problem is later on in the episode we find out that no, really what they need is a race of slave laborers in order to rebuild the planet's surface that has been devastated by nuclear war. So, which is it? I'm not entirely sure. But Captain Pike, of course, refuses to go along with their evil plan. So, the Talosians bring down 2 female crew members, so now he gets to choose between the incredibly diverse selection of a white blonde, a white brunette, and a white redhead. Now, the problem here is that we found out earlier in this same episode that the Talosians could make Mina look literally like any woman he desired, including She-Hulk. So why did they need to bring down alternate choices for him when literally in one person he has every female imaginable? Well, they still refuse, and number one decides that she would rather kill herself and her fellow crew members than... Oh, wait a minute. Wait. Hold on. We got a reckless first officer who's willing to put herself, her captain, and her crew in grave danger just to fulfill her personal agenda? That's incredible. Could this... Oh... Nah, anyway. Number one does manage to convince the Telosians to let them go, but Mina refuses to leave. Pike offers to work with them, but the Telosians refuse, warning that humans would eventually learn their power of illusion and destroy themselves as the Telosians have. Even though they wanted to breed an entire race of humans to be their slaves, I guess they would never learn the power of illusion. And then we find out why Mina refuses to leave the planet. The reason Mina refuses to leave the planet is because she's ugly in real life. That her beauty is nothing more than an illusion cast on by the Telosians, and she doesn't want to look like a hideously deformed individual. She wants to keep pretty so that, she can live in an illusion that she is young forever. And this highlights a lot of the problems with this episode. The writing is horribly self-contradictory. We have, in one scene, Mina agrees to die with Pike.
How primitive humans are, Telosian. You go with her.
If you all think it's this important, then I can't go either. I suppose if they have one human being, they might try again.
And then just a couple of minutes later, she refuses to leave because she wants to stay pretty.
You see why I can't go with you.
This is the female's true appearance.
We have the Telosians saying that they need humans to be their workforce, and yet they don't want to work with humans because humans will eventually learn to cast illusions as they can. We have just all these inherent contradiction after contradiction after contradiction within this episode. So all in all, I would give The Cage a 3 out of 10. There were a couple of good ideas, but the show was just poorly written, poorly cast, and just plain boring from start to end. If NBC had picked up the show with this cast, I would dare say that Star Trek would have faded from memory by 1970, and good riddance. Lucky for us, the second incarnation of Trek is what we ended up getting. The preceding documentary was created for the express purpose of criticism, commentary, and education, and is therefore protected under the Copyright Act of 1976, Section 107, which reads in part, the fair use of a copyrighted work, including such use by reproduction in copies or phonorecords, or by any other means specified by that section, for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, including multiple copies for classroom use, scholarship, or research, is not an infringement of copyright.